The image of Satan is a familiar one. He is seen in many forms throughout history and across many different monotheistic and polytheistic religions, with the Abrahamic religions being the most common source for this mythical antagonist. The likes of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism all in some way refer to Satan as a fallen angel who disobeyed the commands of the Almighty in order to obtain power parallel to that of a god. This video looks to uncover the social, philosophical and theological context of those who have anthropomorphized this mythical adaptation of evil and nonconformity through acts of worship. We will look at the importance of Satan, Satanism and the moral panic that has been associated with this high-profile character throughout the ages and within ancient and modern folklores. So what is behind the obsession with this figure? Well, first we must look to the Christian holy book, although the earliest mentions of Satan appear in early Hebrew texts as Satanas, which means adversary or opposition. In the Bible, before adopting the name Satan, the name of God's fallen angel was Lucifer, and Lucifer was an angel of the Most High. He was loved and respected by God and Jesus alike, and his knowledge and wisdom were revered. He is described in Ezekiel as the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. So what happened? While Lucifer becomes proud, he starts to acknowledge his many God-given qualities and becomes to some extent vain and self-aware. Furthermore, Lucifer becomes jealous and bitter towards Jesus, for he and God have been talking privately, excluding Lucifer from said talks. And with this, Lucifer begins to disobey God and his commands. He starts to dwell on the notion that he himself is of godlike capability and his powers should be recognized as such. Over time, some of the other angels begin to side with Lucifer and this notion of independence and freedom from the divine command of God. After rejecting the attempts made by the Almighty to repent and return to the fold, Lucifer was banished from heaven along with his followers. He now resides on earth, a shell of his former self, and still very much obsessed with the idea of being worshipped as a god. No longer worthy of the name Lucifer, he becomes Satan, the tempter of good people into sin and evil. So what we really have here is the personification of pride and the condemnation of it in Christian societies. Lucifer was revered by God and all other angels as being beautiful, wise, and perfect, but it's when Lucifer begins to see this within himself and begins to hold himself above the moral law that God has decreed that this becomes a problem. So in short, Lucifer is no longer playing ball, rather he's playing for himself. So as Satan is now seen as this personification of pride, greed, vanity, boastfulness and independence from divine command, then this is really what sets the tone for what is valued and what is not valued in Christian doctrines. Blind faith, obedience, modesty and cohesion become virtuous, and things like self-love, self-confidence, cockiness, vanity and so on become vices. In the Judaistic faith, the word Satanas, from which the name Satan in the Christian sense is derived, is a destructive and obstructive force. It's the capacity for evil which resides in us all. And this is what really defines Satan as a figure, and this is what is used as a justification to all kinds of brutal and inhumane forms of violence against those regarded as heretics in Christian societies throughout history. But most importantly, what the Satan figure does is highlight this duality of good and evil, dark and light, right and wrong, yin and yang, that is found all over the world in all kinds of belief systems. The emphasis on this battle of good and evil is really what has shaped our societal values, but it would be wrong to claim that this is a purely Christian phenomenon. And what we begin to see is that the names change throughout certain texts, but the players remain the same. So let's leave Satan at the door for just a moment and look at something that is equally as important when looking at the notion of satanic panic, and I'm talking about paganism and polytheism. Polytheism being the belief in many gods rather than one, much like the gods of ancient Greece or Rome or ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, the duality of dark and light is illustrated through the ongoing conflict between the brothers Horus and Seth. Horus beats Seth every morning, bringing light and life to all. However, Set has his victories too, as he brings darkness and uncertainty into the world every night. In ancient Greece, we have the brothers Zeus and Hades. In Rome, we have Apollo and Pluto. In Hinduism, we have Mithra and Kali. And in Norse mythology, we have Thor and Loki. And so we begin to see that not only is duality important here, but so is the idea of fraternal rivalry, depicting the battle of good and evil as two sides of the same coin. But the duality of dark and light and good and evil is not solely attributed to two deities here, rather many. We have figures like Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, Odin, king of the Norse gods, Mithra, the Jesus of the Hindu faith, Osiris, Isis and Ra of Egypt, Aphrodite, Neptune, Frey, Poseidon, Athena, Pan, Ares, Anubis, and countless others that hold specific attributes and powers that dictate the conditions on Earth. And what's really interesting is up until monotheism, goddesses hold as much power as gods do, and they're revered in much the same way. Druid and pagan religions hold the Mother Nature deity as the Most High, and it's when monotheism comes into it that God takes over and becomes this patriarchal authoritative figure. So really all Satan is, from a theological perspective, is the transformation of many deities of undesirable natures into one deplorable deity. A deity who tries to deceive and trick man into renouncing the divine command of the Almighty, which brings chaos and wrath into the world. And this is described in what St. Augustine terms original sin. The pagan tradition is less about this obedience of divine command and more about the worship and appreciation of the natural world. And it's when Christianity takes over with the invasion of England that the old gods and belief systems are abandoned and even condemned. The label of Satanist begins to be used in around the late 14th and 15th centuries, as many historians note, and the label is used to condemn those who oppose the natural moral law of God. And as mentioned earlier, it becomes the whip that is used to lash the backs of those considered heretics. The witch hunts of the 14th and 15th centuries in Europe are an illustration of this. Many men and women were killed and tortured for supposedly selling their souls to Satan in return for godlike abilities that were used to sabotage the otherwise peaceful society. Those considered Satanists were those who participated in many of the rituals and ceremonies of older pagan societies. Even things such as botany and herbology were considered acts of witchcraft. And so we see that pagan beliefs and polytheism become synonymous with Satanism. It's no surprise then that when the Europeans started migrating to America in the 16th century, that the term Satanist was used as a way of dehumanizing the indigenous peoples there. This branding of the native Indians as devil worshippers is in part what aided and legitimized the idea of manifest destiny that the Europeans saw as their birthright and brought about the genocide of native Indian tribes on the very land that they had inhabited for thousands of years. So that's a very brief and condensed account of the historical context of Satan as a deity or religious figure. Let us now move on to the beliefs and practices of modern-day Satanism. Modern-day Satanism is very much built around this notion of rebellion and individuality that the Lucifer-Satan figure radiates in biblical and other theological mythologies, as Russell notes in 1991. The main premise of modern-day Satanism is that the Christian doctrine and other doctrines of monotheistic prescriptive religions is oppressive. It denies real human nature, which is naturally hedonistic and pleasure-seeking. Now, that's not to say that human nature is bad or entirely self-serving, but that organized religious doctrine places restrictions on people that are contrary to human interest, curiosity, and the search of higher knowledge. And so the modern-day Satanist then is really looking to push against these restrictions such as sex before marriage, the condemnation of intoxication and individuality, questioning the social reality in which we live. The Athlone history of witchcraft and magic in Europe touches on this brilliantly by distinguishing these people as self-styled Satanists, who really subscribe to this idealistic and romanticized view of the fallen angel Lucifer. On the other side of these ideologies is the belief in and the search for the occult and the use of occult practices, and it's in the early 19th century that we really see a rise in the interest in the kind of learned magic of ancient belief systems. And it would be impossible to talk about Satanism without mentioning the man hailed as its founding father, Aleister Crowley, the man who has been dubbed the wickedest man in the world. Aleister Crowley was born in 1875. Born Edward Alexander Crowley, his early life was dominated by the devout and pious teachings of his parents. His father, Edward Crowley Sr., was a self-appointed preacher of the Plymouth Brethren, a Quaker order that believed in the literal word of the Bible. Crowley followed in his father's footsteps and attended a boarding school in Cambridge that was owned by the Brethren. Crowley, however, had begun to develop a sort of critical thinking that challenged many of the teachings that had dominated his childhood, and the death of his father is what really marks the start of Crowley's obsession with sin and the fallen angels of biblical texts. It's around this time also that Crowley starts to fantasize about torture and masochism, probably due to the strict childhood that he had and the use of chastisement within the school. Crowley mentions in his diaries that it was around this time that he murders a local cat. He stabs it, cuts its throat, burns and drowns it, and then tosses the cat out of his window. In the diary, he describes the incident as a purely scientific experiment into the lives of cats. Whilst at the school in Cambridge, he is expelled for corrupting another boy. Now, the nature of this corruption is unknown. In 1894, he attends Trinity College, Cambridge, and changes his name to Aleister. He isolates himself and begins to study the occult. He obsesses over the fallen and sinful characters of biblical mythology, and it's in Stockholm, during a tour of Europe, that Crowley experiences a type of sleep paralysis that he describes as the moment his purpose was made known to him. On return to England, he is desperately longing for knowledge in regards to the occult. He is also trying to bury his homosexual inclinations, which he was deeply embarrassed by, and regularly used prostitutes to do this. It's not until 1898 that he meets Gerald Kelly, who is interested and involved in the occult already. Another friend he makes is a man called George Cecil Jones, a chemist, and Oscar Eckelstein. George Jones and Aleister develop a bond and begin to practice occultist rituals together in Crowley's home. It's Jones who introduces Crowley to the secret society of which he's most associated with, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. However, one of the founders, MacGregor Mathers, is deeply suspicious of Crowley's ability to study only white magic and to fight the temptation of darkness. Mathers' suspicions were proven right when Crowley meets a high-standing member of the order, Alan Bennett. Bennett is offered lodgings in Crowley's apartment in exchange for mentorship. Crowley desperately wants to know the secrets of the occult held by the Second Order, or the Inner Circle of the Golden Dawn. Penniless, Bennett obliges, and the pair spend some time engaging in mind-altering, drug-infused ritual practices, which involved homosexual tantra, or sex magic, which would have been highly illegal at the time. All in the name of magic, of course. From this time, Crowley's engagement in severely depraved acts involving tantra to invoke demons is commonplace. Within the order, he is mistrusted and condemned by those who emphasize the importance of white magic, which is more like yoga. It's about prayer and intention. However, Crowley stops at nothing to obtain the knowledge of magic. He then moves to Loch Ness to live in a house that he could practice his rituals in. He terrorizes the locals in this small village and becomes well known for his depraved activities. Crowley describes in his diary that he unleashed many a demon within the house in Loch Ness. His coach driver, a teetotal man, begins to experience hallucinations. His groundsman goes crazy and tries to kill him, and even the death of a local butcher is accredited to his dark magic. After some time, and unable to stand the insidious atmosphere at his house in Loch Ness, Crowley comes back to England and demands to be admitted into the inner circle of the Golden Dawn. And who should be the one to initiate Crowley but Mathers, who was so deeply suspicious of him in the beginning? However, Mathers now is broke and is facing opposition within the order, and so the two become allies for a very, very short time. Mathers initiates Crowley into the order and teaches him his secrets, and together the two take over the order. However, Crowley's apartment is being watched by the police for suspected homosexual activity, and the two are forced out of the apartment. This disbands the order, and Crowley goes to Egypt with his wife Rose. In Egypt, Crowley becomes more obsessed with the magic of ancient Egyptian mythology and invites the god Horus to possess him in a ritual to give him power, and writes the Book of the Law, from which his most famous quote is derived: "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Crowley continues to practice magic and makes a name for himself throughout Britain and Europe, even working for the British intelligence during the Second World War. He fathers 2 children, both of which die in infancy. There is also a conspiracy theory that Crowley is the father of Barbara Bush, making him the grandfather of George W. Bush. The theory is that Barbara Bush was conceived through a ritual involving sex magic, and that she is the product of satanic worship. Nevertheless, his legacy is extensive and is forever etched into the fabric of modern-day satanic practice. And the bulk of knowledge on this mind-bogglingly depraved yet tortured individual is so extensive that it would warrant a video solely focused on him. Crowley dies in 1947, destitute in America. The next figure who propelled Satanism to where it is today is a man called Anton LaVey. LaVey was born in Chicago in 1930, but spent much of his life in California. He was influenced a great deal by horror and Gothic literature. According to the man himself, he spent many years working in carnivals and circuses. He also spent some time as a police photographer and majored in criminology. He even worked as a psychic investigator, deciphering prank phone calls made to the police, and this gained him some local celebrity. The study of the occult led him, much like Crowley, to dismiss white magic. He also took issue with organized religious doctrines like that of Christianity as being oppressive to human nature. He did stress the need for a religion that catered to the carnal nature of humankind, and he begins giving lectures on the matter to like-minded individuals that he called his magic circle. In 1966, he publicly declares the formation of the Church of Satanism, which is focused on exploring the individualistic reality of human nature. He becomes known as the Black Pope, and in 1969 he publishes the Satanic Bible, and in 1972 publishes the Satanic Rituals. The rituals are published in an ancient language called Enochian, which was translated by the Golden Dawn, and is believed by many to be older than Sanskrit. It's no surprise that with his public declaration of the church and his unconventional sense of style, that LaVey gains celebrity status and appears in the Roman Polanski film Rosemary's Baby. LaVey did not worship Satan as a deity, and the belief and search of the occult is far less prevalent in the church and is of far less importance to LaVey. The only worship really is of oneself and is similar to the teachings of Buddhism in that particular notion of bettering oneself and achieving the goals set by oneself through intention. However, whilst the church rejects rules and blind obedience, LaVey was very clear that people should be law-abiding, and he was a believer in law and order, just not religious doctrine. The church's ideology is social Darwinist. They favour the birth of one great child who, say, will change the future, as opposed to 5 children that can merely believe. A huge part of the church are the elaborate and flamboyant rituals that were really more like performances. Each ritual must be given in a particular language, with particular clothing, and displays of ceremonial dance and song, but no sacrifices, orgies, or narcotic indulgence, which many associate with satanic rituals, like the kind that Crowley advocated and embarked upon. To this day, the Church of Satanism is thriving with thousands of assumed members across the USA, although no UK branches that we know of. The number of people who attend or identify with the Church of Satanism is unknown due to the secret nature of the society. Anton LaVey dies in 1996, and now a man called Peter H. Gilmore assumes his position as the high priest. From interviews given by Gilmore, he seems a very charismatic man who is extremely honest about his beliefs and is concerned with debunking the misconceptions about the Church. He describes the Church as a group of individuals who identify as Satanists in the sense that LaVey established. He denies that although the Church does have rules and leaderships, that it is not a religion of blind faith and conformity. Rather, it is a cabal of people who choose who they deal with and how they conduct themselves. For Gilmore, being part of the Church is about subscribing to the philosophy of nonconformity and individuality. He admits that there are a number of high-profile celebrities who are part of the Church, some publicly and some not, and this is a trend that we've always seen within secret societies. If we just take the cases of Tom Cruise and Madonna and the Church of Scientology as an example, not to mention the Barbara Bush conspiracy that we mentioned earlier in relation to Aleister Crowley. Gilmore states that all religions are show business, and Satanism is the only one that will admit that it is. When asked about the hierarchical structure of the Church, Gilmore states that he is a high priest because he has learned to master magical techniques, and the techniques needed to change the course of one's life through intent. He also said that he has aided the progress of the Church with his writings, and not only this, but he claims that humans are innately hierarchical. He does distinguish between carnal and spiritual people, using Satan in the original Hebrew sense that I mentioned earlier, meaning adversary to the norm and the divine command of God. When asked if the Satanic Bible needed updating, Gilmore has stated that the Bible is not for stupid people, and so does not need to be dumbed down. People should be able to realise the over-the-top nature of the literature. Now, there are other organisations such as the Temple of Set, founded by Michael Aquino, which is made up of defected members of the Church of Satan, that felt that the Church had gained too much publicity and believed the study of magic should be a private matter. Another satanic organisation was the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which has long been dissolved. The next section will focus on the myth of satanic abuse and murder. This is something that is commonly associated with satanic worship, but as we've seen with LaVey's law-abiding principles, is not entirely true. Gilmore does believe in the paranormal, but does not take this to the extremes like figures like Crowley and his allies did. When asked about those who identify as Satanists who commit murders, Gilmore says he holds contempt for those who use the satanic emblem to commit heinous crimes such as murder, rape, torture, pedophilia, etc. There is no Antichrist, according to Gilmore. Satan is but a fictional figure that has been used as an emblem, much like the symbol of Baphomet and the goat's head that is commonly associated with this kind of belief system. So why have there been so many high-profile cases of murder and abuse associated with the cult of satanic worship? Well, the moral panic surrounding satanic ritual abuse and murder began to infiltrate the media and societal discussion in the 1980s and 90s, no doubt due to the secretive nature of such organisations such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Church of Satanism, the Temple of Set, and the Process Church of the Final Judgment, not to mention other secretive organisations such as the Church of Scientology. Interestingly, the founder of Scientology, Harwood, was once a member of the Church of Satanism. Historical high-profile cases of satanic murder and abuse include that of Frank Fuster and Alina Flores in 1984, the Paul Ingram case in 1988, Pablo Verquez case of 1998, who was arrested for drinking the blood of a 12-year-old boy. He apparently beat him with a pipe and then slit his throat. The case of Robin Murphy, who pleaded guilty in 1980 to killing Karen Marsden. The case of Jose Reyes and Victor Elias, who abducted Corian Xavences. Her body was reportedly found with an upside-down cross carved onto her stomach, and she was mutilated and raped by the two Texas teens. Perhaps the most well-known case is that of serial killer Richard Ramirez, who killed 13 people after invading their homes, raping and then brutally murdering them. Another case is that of Perez Espinosa, who was 18 at the time that he killed his mother. He not only skinned her, but also filleted and dismembered her as well, keeping her remains in the freezer. He admitted that the murder was in the name of Satan. No one can deny that these murders did take place, or that they were done in the name of Satanism with a satanic sentiment behind them. But it's this kind of sadistic and brutal crime that is so far removed from the teachings and philosophies of the Church of Satan. Although this was the kind of ritual abuse that Crowley would have and did engage in during his reign over the satanic world, the nature of these crimes go against the very nature of the Satanic Bible, which states that this kind of violence will not be tolerated. Do not make sexual advances unless you are given the mating call. Do not take that which does not belong to you unless it is a burden to the other person and he cries out to be relieved. Do not harm little children. And so we can see that these murders, heinous as they are and done under the name of Satanism, are actually nothing to do with the cult itself, and Peter H. Gilmore has spent a lot of time trying to distance himself from these kind of crimes. But it's precisely these types of fetishized and highly ritualized crimes that give rise to the types of moral panic that Cohen identified in 1972. And it is for this reason that the name Satan and the mention of satanic worship is so heavily stigmatized. But it is not only Satanists who commit such crimes. Consider Charles Manson, whose ideology was of a socialist sentiment, or Jim Jones, whose ideology was Christian, or the cult of the Buddhafield, in which men were routinely raped by its leader Andreas, whose ideology was about enlightenment. The point is that heinous and deplorable crimes happen all over the world in all facets of life, in the places that you'd least expect it. Those who commit such crimes will always use religious and philosophical ideologies to justify their actions, but it is the individual that is to blame for the perversion of any doctrine used to commit acts of suffering and abuse. We have reached the end of this documentary, and with that I bid you good day, and of course, Hail Satan.